This is part 3 of 3 on chapter 5, looking at eukaryotic cells and eukaryotic microorganisms. So just to remind you, the first part of this chapter, we looked at eukaryotic cells, the structure and function of those cells. In the second part of this chapter, we focused on the fungi kingdom. So in this third part, we're going to be looking at the other 3 groups of eukaryotic microorganisms. So here's our survey of eukaryotic microbes. So we looked at the fungi already. So this is going to look at the algae, the protozoans, and the parasitic worms. The algae and the protozoans, they are in the kingdom Protista, or the Protist kingdom. So the algae, they're eukaryotic organisms. They're usually unicellular, although a few are colonial, so the cells will work together. And the algae, they're the plant-like organisms, so they can do photosynthesis, and they have a type of chlorophyll called chlorophyll A. The protozoans, these are the animal-like microorganisms, so they're unicellular eukaryotic organisms. They lack tissues, and they share similarities in cell structure, nutrition, life cycle, and biochemistry. So they're pretty diverse. And the kingdom Protista, it's kind of things we don't really know that much about yet. So this kingdom is still under a lot of modification as we do more of the taxonomy and we look more at the DNA and genetics of these different organisms. So we're going to look at the algae first. So like I said, algae, they're photosynthetic organisms. So they have chloroplast inside of them to help them do this process. The microscopic forms, that's the forms that you need a microscope in order to see. They're usually unicellular, a few are colonial, and then a few are filamentous, so they produce these filaments. Macroscopic forms are colonial, a few are multicellular. Macroscopic forms of algae include kelp and seaweed. Algae, they have cell walls, and the composition of the cell wall can vary very widely with the different species of algae. And then algae, they may or may not have flagella depending on where they live, what the species is, if it's a microscopic form or a macroscopic form. So algae, most are free-living in fresh or marine water, and they make up the majority of plankton. And plankton is kind of like that green scum that you find in water. They produce a very large portion of our atmospheric oxygen. So these algae, they do photosynthesis. They take in carbon dioxide and sunlight. They produce food, and then they release oxygen as a byproduct. In algae, most of them are safe. They don't cause a lot of problems. However, you do have the dinoflagellates that can cause red tides. They give off lots of toxins. And some of these toxins can cause something similar to food poisoning, or they can cause neurological symptoms. So we've actually been kind of seeing this in the news more recently about the algae in the lakes because it's been raining a lot and it's quite hot. So algae classification, they're classified based on their different types of pigments, so they can have different colors, and then also that cell wall composition. And algae, we can find them in cosmetics and food and medical products. So if you actually look at what's in your cosmetics or in your food, you'll see that there's actually a lot of algae that are used in food processing and as preservatives. So these pictures are showing different colors or the different pigments you can see in algae. So there's green algae, there's yellow algae, there's red algae, there's brown algae as well. So that was our algae, and there's only really one type that can cause problems as dinoflagellates. And we'll look at different algae in lab. So our next are the protozoans. So protozoans, it's a very diverse group, about 65,000 species. They vary in shape, and the protozoans are animal-like, so they lack a cell wall. They're heterotrophic, so they have to eat other organisms in order to get their nutrition, so their energy and source of carbon. So protozoans, they all lack chloroplasts, so they cannot make their own food. They can't do photosynthesis. The protozoans, they're unicellular, or a few of them you find in colonies, but most of them are just unicellular, one-celled organisms. And again, the majority of them are harmless. They're free-living in habitats that have water. But the protozoans, some of them are really bad animal parasites, and a lot of them are spread by insect vectors. So these are things like mosquitoes can be a vector, ticks are a vector, other types of bugs can pass these protozoans from one animal to another. So protozoans, they have 2 stages to their life cycle. So some are a trophozoite. This is the motile feeding stage that's active. And you can see this in the top of our life cycle up here. So the trophozoite is the active feeding stage. If that organism gets into an environment that is bad, that trophozoite can form a cyst. So many of them enter into this dormant or resting stage as a cyst. And that's basically just, it protects the DNA, and then once the environment gets better, like we have moisture or we have food available, that cyst is going to break open, and then your trophozoite is reactivated. So these protozoans, they reproduce asexually by mitosis or by fission, and some of them can also reproduce sexually using conjugation. So they will swap DNA, and then you have new genetic combinations that are produced during the conjugation part. Protozoan identification. So protozoans are grouped based on their method of motility, their reproduction, and their life cycle. So most of it's based on their motility, so what structures they have, how they move. So the Mastigophora, these have primarily flagellar movement. So they have flagella on them. It can be 1 flagella, 2 flagella, or more. A few of them move in amoeboid fashion, and then they do sexual reproduction. The Sarcodina, these are primarily amoeboid movement. They reproduce asexually by fission, and most are free-living. The Ciliophora, these move using cilia, so the short hair-like structures covering the entire cell. They have trophozoite and cyst forms in their life cycle. Most are free-living and harmless. And then the 4th group, the Apicomplexa, these ones, they do not have motility, so motility is absent except for the male gametes have flagella on them. They can reproduce sexually and asexually. They can have really complex life cycles, and all of them are parasitic. So the Apicomplexa, these ones, they can actually jump from one species to another in these complex life cycles, and then they cause a lot of problems in animals and also humans. So here we have 2 organisms in the phylum Mastigophora. So these are the ones that have flagella. And you can see the one on the left, that organism just has 1 flagella. And the organism on the right, this is Giardia. It causes an intestinal infection, specifically severe diarrhea, and it has 4 flagella that it can use to move around. The Ciliophora, these are the ones that are covered in cilia, and you can see the short hair-like structures covering the cell in the pictures up here. The Sarcodina, these are the amoeboid organisms. So these are organisms where they put out pseudopods or fake feet, and then they put out these pseudopods, and then they drag the rest of the cell behind it that follow it. And then the Apicomplexa, these are the ones that have really complex lifestyles. They are non-motile, so they don't have flagella, they don't have cilia, they don't have those pseudopods that I just showed you. And these are the ones that can cause a lot of the diseases that we see from the protozoans. this is table 5.5 from your book on page 151. And these are the major pathogenic protozoans that you will see in humans and animals. So you have the amoeboid protozoans. These are ones that are found in water, food, or they're free living. So the amoeboids, in the news recently, there are amoeboids you can pick up from lakes, and amoeboids, they travel to the brain and they can cause brain infections. So they're kind of brain eating or destroying amoebas. There's ciliated protozoans, can pick those up. The flagellated ones, so you have Giardia, so Giardia, that causes diarrhea. Trichomoniasis is another one. The apicomplexa include malaria, toxoplasmosis. Malaria is probably the one that you guys are the most familiar with. And the apicomplexans, they are spread by different vectors. So malaria is spread by mosquitoes. So really important protozoan pathogens include the trypanosomes up here. So we have African sleeping sickness, Chagas disease in South America. And these are spread by it's called the kissing bug because it likes to bite people near the mouth. And these protozoans, they can go from different animal species, so they can jump from one host to another. So they can go from an armadillo to an opossum. It can get into your cat if you let your cat out. And then the bug bites the cat, and the bug can bite humans and pass on this pathogen. Another important protozoan pathogen are those brain-eating amoebas. They cause amoebic dysentery, so it can cause intestinal distress that leads to diarrhea. They can also travel to the brain. And these infective amoebas, you can actually get it from getting water inside of your nasal passage. So if you've ever used a neti pot, make sure that you use distilled water and not tap water when you use this. If you use tap water, it could have an amoeba in it, and then that amoeba can get into other tissues, and it can get into your brain as well. And then finally, we have our fourth group of eukaryotic microbes, the parasitic worms, or the helminths. So the parasitic worms, these are actually in the animal kingdom, so they're multicellular eukaryotic organisms, so they're animals. They have organs for reproduction, they have digestive tract, they're really good at movement, and they have ways to protect themselves. So these are the parasitic worms, and they parasite host tissues. So important characteristics, they can have mouth parts that are used for attachment to the host or to help with digesting host tissue. They have very well-developed sex organs that produce eggs and sperm, so they're animals. That fertilized egg, it goes through a larval period, and that larval period can occur either in or out of the host body. So major groups of parasitic worms, so you have flatworms, they're flat. They have no definite body cavity. They do have a digestive tract, and they have really simple excretory and nervous system. So we have the cestodes, which are tapeworms, and that's shown here in the picture. So we have a tapeworm. And trematodes or flukes, so like the liver fluke, they're also really flat. They're non-segmented worms. They have sucking mouth parts. One cool thing about tapeworms, so tapeworms back in the day, like the 1900s, they would advertise tapeworms as a weight loss method. So people would consume tapeworms. It'd get into your intestinal tract, and basically it takes all of your nutrients. So you eat food, but you're not actually getting any of the nutrients or calories from your food. It's going into the tapeworm. And then once you lose weight, you drink this poison or toxin that's supposed to kill the tapeworms. So that's one really cool thing about the flatworms is the tapeworm diet. Another type of group for these worms are the roundworms, or they're called nematodes. They're round, so they kind of look like earthworms, but littler. They have complete digestive tracts. They have a cuticle that covers their body. And then for their mouth parts, they can have spine or hooks. They have excretory systems. They have nervous systems. They're poorly developed, but they still have them. And then also in the picture you can see a lot of them are, they have ovaries and testicles, so they produce both eggs and sperm in one organism, so they're hermaphrodites. And one example of the roundworm is pinworms, which we see in kids quite a bit. So kids can pick up pinworm eggs or larvae from pretty much anywhere, from each other or from their environment. And then the pinworms will get into the child and cause a lot of problems. So distribution and importance of parasitic worms. So there's approximately 50 different species of parasitic worms that can parasitize humans. And these parasites, they're distributed worldwide. Some you only find in certain geographic areas, and usually you find it in higher incidence in the tropics. So think of malaria as a really good example of this. Malaria, you find it in certain geographic areas, specifically around the tropic areas in the earth. These parasitic worms are acquired through ingesting the larva or eggs in food. You can pick it up from soil or the water. Some of them are carried by insect vectors. Again, malaria is a good example. It's carried by mosquitoes. And these parasitic worms, they can cause billions of humans worldwide to become sick.